You're listening to a podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. To learn more, visit cac.org.
Hey everyone, my name is Corey, and I'm part of the team that produces Everything Belongs. We wanted to let you know that this is part 2 of a 3-part series in responding to the listener questions of Season 1. Thanks for listening.
One of the things that you might notice is that all of us having this conversation are what are we, all about 30s and 40s? I think I'm the old man in the room. And we thought it'd be fun to bring in some different perspectives from outside of the room, maybe a little bit of elder wisdom, and also tap into some of our favorite guests, which is not to say that anyone that you don't hear is not one of our favorite guests. But we have phoned a few friends for a few of your questions. And so you'll hear some outside voices throughout this episode, and we're so excited about their contribution.
All right, so our next question is coming from Pete. He writes, "Hi, thanks so much for the podcast. I've just listened to the latest episode from Dr. B and Brian and found it rich and stimulating. I was surprisingly diagnosed with an incurable cancer at age 48 last year. 12 months on, I'm responding well to chemotherapy, but I know I only have a few years to live, maybe less. Before my diagnosis, I had noticed myself begin the second half of life journey in recent years, having 4 adult kids who still live with my wife and I, and a job where I was increasingly holding a third way space to bring disparate voices together. I was looking forward to a lengthy second half of life to continue to grow and learn, but this has now been cut short. I am learning to enter the grief of this wholeheartedly, as was mentioned at the end of the latest podcast, and have also found a new depth to life despite the disorder and sadness, which is also necessarily and fruitfully repositioning my life with God, often through deep pain and a sense of future loss for myself and my family. My question is, what advice can you offer for those who, like me, who suddenly see their second half of life seemingly disappear in front of them? Thanks so much, Pete."
Hi, Pete. Mirabai here. I'm just sending you love and blessings from Taos, New Mexico, as you take this journey that you're on. And I've been reflecting on your question about second half of life and how you were looking forward to it and how you see it kind of disappearing on the horizon. And I'm thinking about our spiritual aspirations and how we have this conditioned idea that somehow eventually we're going to get it right. You know, we're going to wake up, we're going to become liberated, enlightened, saved, whatever our models might be. And the thing about what you're going through, Pete, is that it is a crash course in being present with things exactly as they are and with yourself, your beautiful, dear, suffering, exalted self, exactly as you are. You know, there's no time for you to try to be pure and perfect. There is only the living fire of the invitation to enter in to the heart of love itself and let that be the truest thing. No goal, Pete, only exactly what is. So deep bow to you from me and much love.
I'm content to leave this to Mirabai. I think it's above our pay grade. I will only say, this was the experience of my mom, who got diagnosed with terminal cancer very unexpectedly, not much older than myself or our listener. And I watched her in the very end of her life, I think, do all the work of a second half of life in a very, very short amount of time. And it was one of the most courageous and beautiful things I've ever seen.
Thanks for sharing that, Michael.
Mm-hmm.
I might just add something of just to say to Pete that our silence is not lack of care. It's pregnant with prayer for you and feeling so many things that are inarticulate, but they come out as groans of prayer, I think.
Yeah, I echo that.
Our next question comes from Simon, and he's trying to figure out how to deal with the feeling of not succeeding in the first half of life by cultural standards. He writes, my question is how to deal with the knowledge that you didn't do the first half of life well according to the culture. As a 9 on the Enneagram, the second half of life makes sense and is welcomed as a relief from the competition and jostling for position in the first half. So success, security, containment, and looking good, as Richard puts it, was not a game I played very well. Having said that, there remain voices, some internal and some spoken by others, including the church, that say you should have been more successful and secure through finances and career and so on. Life would have been easier now. It creates tension and even kind of grieving, a necessary grieving, over the pain of the younger self, but perhaps also for so much of the world that frames reality in the language of the first half of life. Any thoughts?
Paul is our resident Enneagram 9. Do you want to tackle this one first?
Oh, I just relate, Simon, and can feel, I know that angst of, I'm trying to find it here, just the success, security, containment, and looking good, where these are games that we know are happening, but we suck at them and aren't even that interested in them. And at times have to put on the costume of doing them because it's what helps us in the first half of life. So I can feel the pain of you saying that you didn't feel like you did that well. And I think going through that grieving process is a natural kind of re-going through that part of the first half of life, of recognizing the gifts within that, the limitations within that, and just within the culture that you live in. If that is the dominant story, you are also exercising prophetic witness to say these things don't matter, even as you grieve the loss of not participating in them. I think for me, that's also been part of my own midlife journey, is grieving all the roads I did not go down. And I think as to use the Enneagram language, with the 9 of just life constantly overwhelming us and not being able to process it fast enough, I think the first half of life has particular challenges around trying to succeed in that way. But I also trust that there's been some gifts in that process that maybe aren't recognizable at first. That's my 9 hot take.
Dig it.
I think I would just say that one thing I noticed in that question was where they wrote according to the culture, recognizing non-success according to the culture. And I think that stuck out to me because of the wisdom in that. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge, I think that the wisdom in that is there. And I think that I echo, Paul, what you were saying just about recognizing that there's a lot of wisdom and not being attached to those things, not being attached to those versions of success. But that doesn't minimize the grief. That doesn't minimize or take away the pain of needing to grieve those things.
Yeah. I think one of the hardest things to navigate in our life journey is the voice of the internal archetypal accuser, right? In the Christian system, we have this idea of Satan. Satan means the accuser. There is a voice that we internalize, the voice of the culture, the voice of teachers, parents, but it's that voice that tells you that you're never doing enough and you're never measuring up. And that voice drives you and it torments you. It's been given a lot of different names, superego over time. But it's the voice that, again, tricks us into playing worthiness games, that asks us to prove that we're worthy of the unconditional love that the divine lavishes upon us. And I think the great task of life is befriending the accuser and getting to the point that the voice that initially told us that we weren't good enough becomes an ally and turns around and instead questions the scripts that told us we weren't good enough. Says, well, who gets to say what it means to succeed in the first half of life? Who says that I'm falling short? And why am I living for that? And I think that's the gift of what we talk about as disorder, is when that internal accuser becomes an advocate and instead we start to hear the voices of parents and teachers and culture and say, well, who says I have to live life by that rubric?
All right. Our next question comes from Greg. He writes, my family has been through a lot. My wife's postpartum depression, my son's stroke, and now his mental health struggles. It's been a tough journey, but Father Richard Rohr's teaching on non-duality and the bright sadness of life have helped me find some peace. I've been listening to your podcast, and it feels like I'm not alone in this struggle. Now, I'm trying to figure out how to share this understanding with my family, especially my wife, who is hurting, and my kids, who are at different stages of life. The traditional Catholic approach doesn't quite resonate with my experience, and I'm looking for more meaningful ways to connect with my faith with the realities of our lives. I'm writing to you, hoping for some guidance on how to navigate this complex terrain of faith, suffering, and family.
I think what's been beautiful for me that Richard has taught me is a different way of understanding the cross. I grew up in a theological system that taught me that Jesus suffered for me so I didn't have to, and Jesus died for me so I could live forever. And the great gift of Richard's teaching and a lot of the mystics in the contemplative has been shifting away from that substitutionary thinking to one of total solidarity and realizing it's not that Jesus suffered for me, it's that Jesus suffers with me, or that the divine suffers with me. It's not that Jesus died for me, it's that Jesus or the divine dies with me. No one suffers alone. No one dies alone. We are not alone. And in the invitation to imitate Christ, like, we are called to be there with each other in our loneliness and in our suffering. And this is the great work of love and community, which is how to meet in sorrow, sadness, and celebration. So what I hear in this question is like the great work of love and the divine life in humanity. And we are so excited to invite our friend Aaron Sanzero, who's had quite a journey with family and relationships and loved ones in carrying the highs and the lows of living and loving, and really excited to hear what she has to offer.
Thanks so much for these 3 questions, Greg. While I hesitate to tell you what to do, I think the answer is wholly listening. I think so often when we think about stepping into action, we get ourselves wrapped around the axle or tongue-tied trying to think of the right thing to do or the perfect thing to say and how to solve the problem and achieve the goal. And I think we miss often the thing that's right there in front of us, plain as day, presence. And really the work of cultivating a practice of presence that's really grounded in humility and love and holy listening, not answers. I think when we focus on the power of our presence and we give that gift of our undivided attention, we can really create that safe, sacred space where we can open up to each other and we can share. And what a tremendous gift to start by seeking to understand with your loved ones instead of seeking to be understood. Whether it's your wife, your older son, your child, being present to where they're at, holding their grief and hope together as you listen compassionately and non-judgmentally. I think that's a really beautiful way for you all to break down some of these relationship walls and open that space between your hearts. So my hope for you is that as you practice presence and holy listening, that you can trust that God will dwell in that space.
Everything Belongs will continue in a moment.
What does it mean to embody salt and light? In 2025, Richard Rohr's daily meditations turn to Jesus' timeless metaphor for reflecting love into the world. Amid this season of uncertainty, join us in living with trust, being salt and light. For 18 years, the daily meditations have inspired thousands of readers like you. Subscribe today at cac.org/saltlight2025. That's cac.org/SALTLIGHT2025.
This is coming from Kentaro. I hope I'm saying the name right. He writes, "Hello, thank you for the Everything Belongs podcast where you ask for questions. I believe I heard someone mention a third half of life in one of the episodes, and I love any reflections or musings on that. A note of gratitude as well. I'm a 51-year-old man, and about 10 years ago, I had a life-changing heart attack in the part of the heart where they call the Widowmaker. And the following year, I went to the Illumin conference with a couple of friends in Albuquerque where Richard Rohr spoke on the theme of drawing from a deep well. At that conference, he invited the young men, quote unquote, under 45 years old, which was quite humorous to me because no one I knew considered me a young man in my 40s, to sit with him for lunch at a large round table. 2 years later, my family and I moved to San Francisco, where we sold our house and left all we knew, including good jobs and strong community, for me to enter what I call my midlife crisis doctoral program in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was life-changing. I listened to Richard Rohr and other CAC staff's books and podcasts multiple times over these past number of years. I'm certain that I've listened to well over 1,000 hours of CAC books and podcasts because they are almost always on repeat. I quote Richard Rohr to the point that my family and friends make fun of me, but honestly, he and others at CAC have changed my life. Hopefully, I am living in a way that can provide others with hope in a similar way that I feel like the CAC has given me hope. Thank you, Kentaro.
Before we dive into the conversation, could someone unpack this third half of life concept?
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting, I'm really glad you asked, Cassidy, is this came of kind of really fun, playful conversations that Jim Finley and Richard have been having as they're both 81 years old and both sort of embracing the mortality and being very happy and also saying things like, oh, if it's our time, we're ready to go. And they're jokingly saying they're in the third half of life. That is a completely different season than what Richard talks about the first and the second half of life. Another thing that I think is relevant to this that emerged in the podcast, I think for me, it started with a great episode we had with Aaron, who had written an article about midlife as a part of the journey, and really recognizing that there is the first half of life and there's the second half of life, but there's this huge middle act of midlife where we're sort of balancing both. And last but not least, from staff and listener feedback, one of the things that really has become apparent that we've learned a lot in the last year is that, you know, when you read Falling Upwards, you sort of end up trying to live in both halves of life at the same time in the liminal space of holding both realities. Does that make sense? And does that reflect your life experience in any way?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it definitely makes sense. I can't speak to the idea of third half of life, right? Because I'm 40. But conceptually, I love it. And I love the liminality of it all. I also love just the paradoxical language of it because I'm an Enneagram 5 of third half, right? The incongruence of that is really beautiful, actually.
Yeah, it is a really fun, and it works exactly. Like, thanks for pointing that out because the clunkiness of it is what makes it genius. The third half of life.
Yeah, I'm clearly not in my third half of life either, unless we redefine it in a way of the midlife, which I think is a fun kind of push and pull to see the multiple potential halves. And one of the things I've appreciated about this conversation throughout the season, particularly today, is even though, you know, we tend to worship the written word, I think, in our culture. Like if it's printed, then it's like, well, it's right here, we can reference it. But that's a starting point for the conversation. Like even Richard, who wrote a book on the two halves of life, is like, well, there's a third half of life. And in our conversations here, well, there's potentially a third half in the mid half. Yeah. And how we're just kind of allowing the dexterity of it to expand and contract. And I've so enjoyed hearing Jim and Richard talk about this because part of what I feel like they're pointing to is like the journey continues. Like there is no period. It's another comma of mystery that is meeting us and residing within us as whatever age we're at. If we feel like the sunset's about to come, or if we hypothetically we think it's a ways away yet. I appreciate that sense of unknowing awe that I can hear in both Richard and Jim and the twinkle in their eye as they joke about the third half of life.
It's been a gift to recognize the liberation and the freedom And again, the twinkle in both of their eyes right now, where they literally are like, tomorrow's not promised to either one of us. And they're so at peace with it and also so playfully present to what life has to offer. And also not ignorant of the fact that we're living in dire times. And yet there's a grace with which they hold that, which I find so inspiring. And it's such a privilege to get to witness it. I also want to point out that as a practical manual, one of the guests we interviewed this season was Connie Zweig. Connie talked to us about doing shadow work, but Connie has also written an award-winning book called The Inner Work of Aging, Moving from Role to Soul. And she really unpacks the second half of the second half of life. And I think that book could almost be read as a sequel to Falling Upward. And she looks at the initiations of retirement, illness, and death as three things that really, really bring folks into a greater place of depth in that season of life. And for some of our listeners, that book is 100% worth picking up.
That's a great resource. I love that, because I also think what it reminds me of too is like, who in our lives do we see either entering the third half of life, and who's doing that well? Like I feel like my parents are doing some of these things really well. And like from a very practical point, they don't have to be a spiritual master to the world. They can also be folks in your community. And like, where are those models? And I think having a book like that helps you recognize the models that might be around you already.
It is interesting for the four of us around our late 30s and 40s, and me late 40s, recognizing the folks who have really done this work of transitioning from role to soul. We get to recognize, we get to experience the gift of having true elders in our lives. And as sort of my second to last thing to ask the two of you as we land it, who's an elder who's inspired you, especially as we've talked about falling upwards and looking back? Where do you experience someone in your life who's really done the work? You just talked about your folks. And what do they teach you about what it means to be and also to have a good guide? We've clearly identified Richard and Jim Finley. I would throw Dr. Barbara Holmes in there as well.
I was going to say all of our core faculty could be on there. Maybe we'll just not go there as a way, because we've already kind of celebrated how much impact and their work has had on so many.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say I'm really inspired by those who continue to engage a rhythm in their lives, whatever that might be, their routine, their contemplative practice, but also still remain open to wonder. Because the older we get, I find the older I get, the more I become less immune to new things or discomfort or difficulty or challenges or things that take me out of my expectations or rhythms, right? And so I think seeing people in my life that remain open to wonder amid that rhythm just really, really inspires me. And I see that in my parents. I see that in the person who leads the Indie Zen Center practice here. And it's a really, really remarkable thing.
I love that.
I think I would also say to the listener, what I've loved about this conversation is how we're reaching for language and words to make sense of what's happening in our lives. And, you know, I'm thinking about the question earlier about pruning, and then also thinking about the language of the dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking about, you know, this language of third half. And it's kind of like, well, what language is working for you right now in your life, and embracing that so that we can be in that liminality or be in that space or be in that unknown. And I think there's something so refreshing about, okay, accepting I'm in my midlife and navigating what that is after naming it.
Cassidy, think about your work on queering contemplation. And I appreciate everything you just said about recognizing the language that works, and then also sometimes recognizing things that are not working. Is there a way that you would connect sort of, and this is a silly question, but I think it's also a poignant one. Is there a way to sort of queer how we think about these things? Dark night of the soul, pruning, of course, but first half of life and second half of life.
Oh, I love that question. I think anytime we look at something through a new angle or a new lens, we give ourselves permission to see it differently, but not just to see it differently, also to see beyond what is for what could be. And it's all of this is stepping back into the unknown and stepping back into releasing our clenched fists in order to hold what's happening, but also with this ability to be free to see possibility. Yeah, queering, looking at this is a really interesting thought, because I think, much like anything, it would look different for everyone. And that's what's so beautiful about it. Either of you describing midlife is different from the way I will describe it. And that's a really beautiful thing.
Amazing. As we bring this whole season to a close, I love this invitation for all of us to be in the liminal space where we are living the first half of life in light of the second half of life in light of the first, all of it in light of the third. Any closing comments on how we stand in that liminal space and embody this beautiful teaching going forward?
Thanks, Mike. I found the conversations this season, and then landing here with this conversation with you, Cassidy, and all the listener questions, I just feel like I'm in a state of gratitude and humility of the depth of my unknowing continues to surprise me about just the different textures of our lives and how the questions arise and are heartfelt, and we're all pining from this sense of, I want to call it divine loneliness, for connection with one another and for the beloved. And I'm in awe of that, and it humbles me to stay the course and keep doing the work that I need to do, so I can be a person of deeper humility and vulnerability and desire towards the good, the true, and the beautiful. So I have nothing but gratitude.
Divine loneliness. I love that. I love that. And I love that as a commonality. And I think part of that is the liminal space, right?
Yeah.
For the contemplative life, that divine loneliness is a part of the liminal space. And so, yeah, I think in conclusion, I would just say that, and I say this to myself also, that we're not alone in that we're not alone in that divine loneliness.
I love the liminality of that. In a lot of spiritual direction conversations, I love when someone says, I don't know where to start the story. And you can say, start in the middle, because we're always in the middle. And here we are, never less alone than when we feel alone, meeting each other in the middle of the mess. What a gift. Cassidy, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here. Yeah,
Such
love
a gift
chatting.
to have you here.
So fun.
Thanks for listening to this podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation, an educational nonprofit that introduces seekers to the contemplative Christian path of transformation. To learn more about our work, visit us at cac.org. Everything Belongs is made possible thanks to the generosity of our supporters and the shared work of
Mike Petro,
Paul Swanson,
Jenna Kuiper,
Izzy Spitz,
Megan Hare,
Sarah Palmer,
Barb Lopez,
Brandon Strange,
and me, Corey Wayne. The music you hear is composed and provided by our friends Hammock. And we'd also like to thank Sound On Studios for all of their work in post-production. From the high desert of New Mexico, we wish you peace and every good.
Do you feel called to walk a more contemplative path? The Center for Action and Contemplation is an educational nonprofit supporting the journey of inner transformation. Our programs and resources will help grow your consciousness, deepen your prayer practice, and strengthen your compassionate engagement with the world. Learn more about our resources, such as publications, podcasts, email series, and events at www.cac.org.